This is a special bonus edition of Judaism Unbound, Levy's Jewish Rye. Every year, the American Jewish Historical Society hosts a conference of American Jewish historians. In 2018, this conference took place at the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. Dan and I were both thrilled to attend the event, and while we were there, we took the time to speak with a wide variety of scholars about artifacts in the museum exhibition itself. We looked at these artifacts both in their initial historical context and as a map onto contemporary Jewish issues. We're thrilled to now be releasing these conversations as bonus episodes on Judaism Unbound's feed, and in this one, we're thrilled to feature Beth Wenger, who serves as Moritz and Josephine Berg Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania and as Chair of the History Department. For this bonus conversation in particular, which describes an advertisement from Levy's Jewish Rye, we highly recommend looking at a visual because it'll be hard to understand some elements of the conversation unless you see the advertisement itself. And you can access that by clicking the link in the description of this podcast in iTunes or Apple Podcasts or Overcast or whatever podcatcher you're using, which will take you to the show notes on our website that has an image. All right, so tell us what artifact we're looking at.
So we're looking at a very well-known print ad for Levy's Rye Bread. And this one, the one that we're looking at, is from 1976. And this particular one is a photograph of a Native American eating a sandwich with Levy's Rye Bread. And of course, the famous caption is, "You don't have to be Jewish to love Levy's Real Jewish Rye."
Tell us a little bit more. What do you think is being communicated here? Tell us about this. You don't have to be Jewish to love Levy's Real Jewish Rye.
Let me start with the background of how the ad came into being. Levy's Rye was, of course, a company. It was a Brooklyn company. Henry Levy and Sons Bakery in Brooklyn served mostly an Orthodox Jewish clientele. And they made, at first, fresh bagels, rolls, challah. A little later on, they started making packaged bread, packaged rye bread, raised bread for a wider marketplace. Although they thought that perhaps they lost their core clientele when they started packaging. We don't know that for sure, but what we do know for sure was that they were losing business. They were essentially going bankrupt as a bakery. So they turned to a then little-known ad agency called Doyle, Bain, Bernbach, and specifically they worked with Bill Bernbach, who helped devise this ad. Now, you should know that this company, DDB, became one of the most powerful advertisers around, but at the time they weren't that yet, so a little company like Levy's could afford to hire them. Their first ads played on the notion of Jewish food as being kind of nutritious. It actually played on the Jewish mother stereotype of feeding their kids a lot. In fact, the first ad the caption said, "Is his bread a filler-upper or a builder-upper?" And so the notion was, of course, this bread was a builder-upper. And that was the first not-so-successful or well-known advertisement that they tried and didn't succeed. And this was the later iteration. What we're looking at here is the advertisement that features a Native American man, but there were actually a series of these with different people, all meant to look not Jewish. Probably the Native American man is maybe the most well-known, but equally well-known is a young African American boy also eating a sandwich with Levy's Rye Bread. And the notion here is an interesting one. So obviously, the advertisers have come up with this new concept that you don't have to be Jewish to love Jewish foods. So what are they doing? Well, on the one hand, you can say they're putting up all these different minority groups at a very early time, before minority groups were figured in much American mainstream advertising. And that's one thing they're doing. But it's not that they're trying to overcome stereotypes simply. What they're doing is they're acknowledging ethnic difference, but they're saying it doesn't matter in this case. So what they're doing here is that they're being funny, they're effective, they're not ignoring that stereotypes exist. They're saying, okay, we know these stereotypes exist. We're going to embrace them first, and then we're going to reject them. Because the truth is, food is ethnic, and food is universal. So in some ways, I think it was that creativity that made the ad so lasting and popular and sparked a lot of other kinds of ads that imitated it in some ways, like you don't have to be Irish to like Celtic music, or you don't have to be X to like Y, became a sort of formulation. And this was voted, this is an award-winning ad at the time, a sort of 100 best ad campaigns of the time. And I think very much part of this era, right, coming out of the civil rights movement, the 70s, and a time, probably the beginning of seeing minorities in advertisements.
So I saw the ad with the African-American boy first. And I saw it in the context of a conversation. It was shown to me in the context of a conversation about the idea of looking Jewish. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that clearly is relevant here because the whole premise is that these people don't look Jewish and that therefore there is a kind of looking that does look Jewish that is different. And presumed, I would argue, and I don't think it's a stretch, I think it's pretty clear, is that somebody who's white looks more Jewish than somebody like in this image who is a Native American, or in that other image, somebody who is African American. So I guess to stretch this to its ramifications for our era today, where more and more Jews are not white, and there's many Jews of color. Many statistics show that it's somewhere in the range of 10 to 20% of American Jews are Jews of color. What kind of harm maybe does this kind of ad do, and what should we be thinking about as we engage with it, not just as sort of cute, but as complicated?
So it's a very interesting question, and I'll tell you this story first. I often show this ad, both this one of the Native American man and the one of the African American child, in the first lecture that I give in my American Jewish History Survey course. And to my surprise, my students often, I leave it open. What does this say to you? What does this mean about Jewishness, about America? And some of them, without fail, will say, this seems racist to me. And it's unusual. Me as an historian, I understand it at the time as being actually quite the opposite. Its intent was quite the opposite. And it just goes to show you that things change, images change meaning over time. It was absolutely not seen as racist in its day, in the 70s, when it became popular. But today, when my students, whether they know your statistics about Jews of color, they think it's absurd to assume that all Jews would look white. They think it's a little bit manipulative to be working with typing a Native American and an African American that way. So we live in a time of different racial sensibility that inflects how we view this advertisement.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for this. I mean, is there anything else that's worth ruminating on or thinking about in the context of this ad and its place in American Jewish history?
I want to say one thing that's not so much about American Jewish history. There's a famous photograph of Malcolm X taking his picture in front of the ad of the African American child. He liked it. He thought it was interesting and funny, and it's such a striking contrast to see the militant Malcolm X standing in front of the photograph of this African American child. And in many ways, it's a playful, interesting image, rich with how the ways that American Jews have interacted in such sometimes fraught, complicated, intersecting ways with racial and ethnic groups in America.
Well, Beth, thank you so much. This has been a really fantastic and illuminating conversation.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
We hope you've enjoyed listening in to this bonus episode of Judaism Unbound, and we also encourage you to check out all of our other historical bonus conversations by heading to Apple Podcast or Stitcher or Overcast or anywhere else where podcasts are featured. As always, we encourage you to be in touch with us, and you can always hit us up via email at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com with any questions, follow-ups, concerns, comments, whatever you've got. So thanks so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.